Good morning. Good morning. Good morning, everyone, and it's good to see you all here today. Well, in recent weeks, we've been discussing the Diamond Sutra, which is, I would say, intellectually challenging. It challenges our usual assumptions and perceptions, encouraging us to view the world with greater fluidity, interrelatedness, a world in constant flux in which no object has a fixed essence. But I would like to now turn to another text, which is quite a bit different. This is a text from the early Buddhist tradition, the Pali Canon, called the Dhammapada, and many of you may be familiar with it. It's one of the most popular books about Buddhism out there. The Dhammapada was really unknown in the West until the mid-19th century when a Danish scholar translated it into Latin. And subsequently, later in the 19th century, Max Muller translated it into English. That was the first English translation. And then there have been scores of English translations since then. And I'm embarrassed to say I have several of them. The Dhammapada is a relatively short text. It's 26 short chapters, and it's written in verse form. And most of the English translations try to mimic that verse form. I understand it's quite musical in Pali, but in English, perhaps not so much. Some of the translation is challenging, including the title, Dhammapada. So Dhamma, as we've talked about before, has not only different translations, but different actual meanings. It can refer to the Buddha's teaching. It can refer to just the reality of what is. It can refer to the objects of human experience, phenomena, what we view as phenomena as humans. So it can refer to objects of the senses, the usual five senses, but also objects of the mind, thoughts. In this title, it probably occupies the meaning of reality as it is, things as they are. And pada comes from the root meaning foot, and it is sometimes translated as like a footpath or a path. It sometimes is translated as verse because it has, like Dhamma, multiple meanings in Pali. So these are verses about reality or verses about or the path whereby we can better understand or come to some grips with reality. Dhammapada. Sometimes the Dhammapada is, I wouldn't say disparaged, but perhaps belittled a bit because it's just a series of aphorisms, often moralistic aphorisms. And it may, at first reading, seem kind of simple-minded, with the main message being don't do bad things, do good things, and stay awake. And it does have that message. But I think there are many layers of meaning in these verses. And I think they warrant visiting multiple times, rereading, reflecting upon them, reading them slowly. And so we'll just take, for the next few weeks anyway, just some of the verses and try to reflect upon them. I'm relying mostly for translation on Gil Fronsdal's translation, a Western Buddhist practitioner, mostly associated with the Zen tradition, and also a writer on his own right and poet. So he has, I think, offers a very accessible translation that is as accurate as a translation can be, I would say that. I'll read the first two verses. All experience is preceded by mind, led by mind, made by mind. Speak or act with a corrupted mind, and suffering follows, as the wagon wheel follows the hoof of the ox. All experience is preceded by mind, led by mind, made by mind. Speak or act with a peaceful mind, and happiness follows, like a never departing shadow. So many of the people, probably the vast majority of the people who heard the Buddha's teachings in person, were illiterate. And composing things in verse was a way of helping people remember things. And also repetition is a way of helping people remember things. So in the early Buddhist teachings, there's much repetition and versifying. This chapter is called, Gil Fronsdal calls it dichotomies. It's sometimes called twins or pairs. So you basically have a set of usual opposites. Here we have corrupted mind and peaceful mind. Now, in this translation, the English word experience is used for the Pali word dhammas. In this case, dhammas does not refer to all reality. It refers to our perceptions of reality, the objects of our senses and our mind, the things we see and hear, the things we think. All of this is preceded by mind. In other words, it comes through our mind. And mind is a complicated word, but it is a translation from the root mano, M-A-N-O, in Pali. And mano, as I understand it, refers to more the intentional mind, the volitional mind, the mind that decides how to respond to whatever the circumstance is. So all our phenomena are preceded by this volitional mind, led by mind, made by mind. In other words, we more or less create our world. And if our response to that creation of the world is speech or action that is governed by a corrupted mind, corrupted, sometimes it's translated as evil, but I think that's just too strong. But it certainly refers to a mind that is not seeing things clearly, that has obscurations of greed, hatred, and delusion. And the conceit of a fixed self in service to the notion of a fixed, separate self. Corrupted mind. In the first verse says that in that circumstance that we can count on suffering for ourselves and presumably others. Whereas the second verse offers some hope, and that's saying that if there is a peaceful mind, sometimes the word translated as peaceful is also translated as bright or pure. In that circumstance, happiness follows predictably, like a never departing shadow. So these first two verses really get at a core teaching of the Buddha, which has to do with cause and effect, what we would call karma, intentional action. Intention, if wholesomely directed, leads to peace and happiness, whereas unwholesomely directed mind intention leads to suffering. Um, Now, we might stop at this moment and think, but wait, but wait. Sometimes, first of all, sometimes it's not. This seems to indicate that in encountering a choice in life, that there is a clear difference between what is wholesome and what is unwholesome, what is likely to lead to long-term benefit, what is likely to lead to problems, suffering. And we all know from experience that that is not always the case. Sometimes there are competing values or competing interests that perhaps some people will benefit from this, but other people will not. And and there's uncertainty about the outcome for various outcome of various actions, so that we may have good intentions and operate in good faith, but the results are not favorable for either ourselves or for others or both. So there's some complexity to this. But I think it's important to view these verses as aphorisms. They're sort of, going back to that root pada, they're sort of footholds. There's something to remember at the right time that generally good intentions lead to good outcomes. It reminds us to pay attention, particularly to the subtleties of our intentions. Becoming familiar with mind in that way so that the subtleties of intention are more apparent is one of the products of sitting meditation. And I think it's important to acknowledge that these are aphorisms and not guarantees, that sometimes our best efforts at intentional action go awry and lead to problems. Now, some purists regarding the notion of karma will object and say, well, you're not taking into account um, actions in previous lives which are playing out in this life, or actions you may have forgotten about that are playing out now. I think whether you try to revive the perfection of the theory of karma or not is really beside the point. These verses remind us to pay attention carefully to our intentions. The next, there are next group of verses in the Dhammapada goes something like this. He abused me, attacked me, defeated me, robbed me. For those carrying on like this, hatred does not end. She abused me, attacked me, defeated me, robbed me. For those not carrying on like this, hatred ends. Hatred never ends through hatred. By non-hate alone does it end. This is an ancient truth. This is a sentiment that I think is probably held in common by really all the major religious traditions, that responding with vengeance doesn't work in the long run. It just leads to a cycle, a downward cycle of hatred and suffering, which we can see playing out daily if we look at the news. I think there is an important issue regarding translation in this. Well, actually, it's three little verses. And that has to do with the comparison of hate to non-hate. The root from which in Pali hate is translated is vera, V-E-R-A, vera. And that, and the root from which in this translation, non-hate is translated as avera. Now, when the is kind of a negation, but it can have two shades of meaning. One is that of just the absence of hate, and that's what this translator has chosen, calling it non-hate. Most other translators have considered it the opposite of hate and translated it as love or loving kindness or kindness or friendliness. I think it makes considerable difference in that if one translates it as love, then it sort of gives you a place to start. If you translate it as non-hate, it's like, well, don't hate, but then what do you do? There's that last little verse can be translated in this manner. In this world, hate never yet dispelled hate. Only love dispels hate. This is the law, ancient and inexhaustible. Um, I mentioned that this is a sentiment held in common by virtually all religious traditions. And there's a quote from Martin Luther King that I can't help but believe, um, because Martin Luther King was very widely read. I can't help but believe that he didn't encounter this verse in the Dhammapada. In one of his speeches, in one of his sermons, he said, and this is taken from the early 60s or late 50s, returning hate for hate only multiplies hate, adding a deeper darkness to a night already devoid of stars. Darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that. So how we apply this, I think, is oftentimes challenging. But at the very least, it reminds us of the futility of vengeance. And perhaps going further, it reminds us of the power of kindness, friendliness, love. Love in this sense, of course, meaning non-erotic, unconditional, universal love. The last couple verses I'll just cover briefly. One who recites many teachings, but being negligent, doesn't act accordingly, like a cowherd counting others' cows, does not attain the benefits of the contemplative life. One who recites but a few teachings, yet lives according to the Dharma, abandoning passion, ill will, and delusion, aware with mind well freed, not clinging in this life or the next, attains the benefits of the contemplative life. So in future weeks, I would like to go through some selections from the Dhammapada and just give them a little bit more time for reflection. Again, I think this text can bear multiple readings over time. I find that when I return to it each time, I read it differently and have more appreciation for it. So that is a start then on the Dhammapada. So I guess I would leave you with the questions of these aphorisms that we discussed, how do we apply them? How do we give them depth? How do we remember them at the right time? How do we cultivate the qualities that allow us to benefit from this advice? Thank you very much for listening. And we'll go into breakout rooms now, and then we'll reconvene in a few moments. I'd like to just, let me see.